They stood in the turrets of Tigers and Panthers, their names whispered in terror across battlefields from France to the Russian steppe. The men who commanded Germany's panzer forces were the architects of blitzkrieg, masters of mechanized warfare whose tactical brilliance had rewritten the rules of modern combat. But in the spring of 1945, when the Third Reich collapsed into rubble and ash, these elite commanders faced a reckoning unlike anything they had encountered on the battlefield. Some would hang, others would rebuild. Many would simply disappear into the fractured landscape of post-war Europe, carrying with them the weight of a war that had consumed 50 million lives. The paradox was cruel. The same military skill that had made them legends would now determine whether they faced justice or opportunity, execution or employment, imprisonment or influence in a world divided by new ideologies and old grudges. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the war forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The fate of Germany's tank commanders was not written in courtrooms alone. It was shaped by the chaotic calculus of post-war occupation, where Allied powers juggled competing priorities of punishment, pragmatism, and the emerging Cold War. The Waffen-SS tank officers faced different consequences than Wehrmacht panzer leaders. Those who had committed documented war crimes confronted military tribunals. Those whose service remained technically within the bounds of military conduct found themselves in a strange limbo where yesterday's enemy might become tomorrow's ally. The hierarchy of culpability was established quickly. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, Allied forces began the massive task of processing millions of prisoners of war. Tank commanders, identifiable by their decorations and unit assignments, were separated for special interrogation. The distinction between the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS became legally significant. The Nuremberg trials of 1945 to 1946 declared the SS a criminal organization, but the Wehrmacht was spared this collective judgment despite documented atrocities committed by regular army units. This legal fiction would profoundly affect individual fates. Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored doctrine, the man who had written the textbook on panzer warfare and led devastating offensives across Poland, France, and Russia, surrendered to American forces on May 10, 1945. He was 56 years old. His name carried weight. He had served as acting chief of the German General Staff, placing him in Hitler's innermost military circle. Yet Guderian had never been a member of the Nazi Party, a distinction that would matter greatly in the denazification tribunals. He was held in various detention facilities until 1948, questioned extensively by Allied intelligence officers eager to understand German military thinking and Soviet capabilities. His troops had executed the criminal commissar order during Operation Barbarossa, and he had served on the court of honor that expelled officers implicated in the July 1944 plot against Hitler, sending them to certain death in Nazi courts. But no specific war crimes were directly attributed to his personal command. In 1948, he was released without charge. Guderian retired to Schwangau in Bavaria, where he began writing his memoirs. Published in 1951 as Panzer Leader, the book became an international bestseller. In it, Guderian carefully crafted a narrative of professional military competence untainted by Nazi ideology, a version of history that downplayed Wehrmacht criminality and portrayed German generals as honorable soldiers fighting a clean war. This myth of the clean Wehrmacht found eager audiences in the West, where Cold War anxieties made former German officers seem like valuable assets rather than defeated enemies. Guderian died in 1954, his reputation largely intact, his sins largely forgotten. Otto Carius survived the war with more than 150 enemy tanks destroyed, one of the most successful tank commanders in history. He had fought primarily on the Eastern Front, commanding Tigers and later Jag Tigers. In the final weeks of the war, trapped in the Ruhr pocket, Carius ordered his remaining Jag Tigers destroyed to prevent capture and surrendered to American forces on May 7, 1945. He was 23 years old. Unlike the SS officers, Carius was a Wehrmacht soldier. He was released from American captivity on May 21, 1945, after just 2 weeks. The distinction saved him. Carius enrolled at Heidelberg University to study pharmacy. He worked through his studies, graduated, and in 1956 opened a pharmacy in the small town of Herschweiler-Pettersheim. He named it Tiger Apotheke, the Tiger Pharmacy, a quiet monument to his wartime service. In 1960, he published his memoir, Tigers in the Mud, a detailed account of his combat experiences that became required reading for military historians and tank enthusiasts. Carius never faced trial. He never expressed public remorse for serving a regime that had initiated a war of annihilation. He ran his pharmacy for 55 years, a respected member of his community, before retiring in 2011. He died in 2015 at age 92, having outlived nearly all his contemporaries by decades. His story represented one possible outcome: reintegration into civilian life, economic success, and the gradual fading of wartime identity into the routine of ordinary existence. But not all tank commanders found such peaceful transitions. The Waffen-SS officers faced a different reckoning entirely. Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge, was a Hitler favorite, a crude but loyal Nazi who had risen to the highest SS rank despite minimal formal military education. He surrendered to American forces on May 9, 1945, and was immediately designated for war crimes prosecution. The Malmedy Massacre, the murder of 84 American prisoners of war by troops under his command during the Ardennes Offensive, became the centerpiece of his trial. In 1946, at the Malmedy Massacre trial held in Dachau, Dietrich was convicted of ordering that troops under his command create a wave of terror and execute prisoners when necessary. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence was later reduced to 25 years due to controversies over interrogation methods used to obtain confessions. Dietrich served 10 years at Landsberg prison before being released on parole in October 1955. But his freedom was brief. In 1956, German authorities arrested him again, this time for his role in the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, when he had provided SS firing squads to execute SA leaders on Hitler's orders. He was convicted of being an accessory to manslaughter and sentenced to 18 months imprisonment. After losing his appeals, he returned to Landsberg in 1958. He was released in February 1959 due to heart problems and circulatory issues. Dietrich spent his final years active in HIAG, a lobbying organization of former Waffen-SS members that campaigned for the rehabilitation of the SS. When he died of a heart attack in 1966, 6,000 people attended his funeral, including hundreds of former SS men. The spectacle demonstrated that, even 2 decades after the war, significant segments of German society still honored men who had served Hitler's most fanatical military formations. Joachim Peiper's fate was darker still. Commander of Kampfgruppe Peiper during the Battle of the Bulge, Peiper had been Himmler's personal adjutant, a true believer in Nazi ideology who had witnessed the Holocaust's implementation firsthand. His battle group was responsible for multiple war crimes during the Ardennes Offensive, most notoriously the Malmedy Massacre. Captured on May 22, 1945, Peiper was held at Freising, then transferred to Schwäbisch Hall with approximately 1,000 other Waffen-SS soldiers awaiting trial. At his trial in 1946, Peiper was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. But the sentence was reviewed. Claims of coerced confessions and improper interrogation techniques created controversy. In 1948, his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. In 1951, it was further reduced to 35 years. On December 22, 1956, after serving 11 years, Piper was released on parole. He went to work for Porsche, then Volkswagen, as a sales trainer, but his past would not release him. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, his identity as a war criminal made employment difficult. In 1972, he moved to Treves, France, working as a freelance translator in a small cottage. He lived quietly, isolated, using a pseudonym. But in 1976, his true identity was discovered by communist activists. On the night of July 13, 1976, arsonists set fire to his house. Piper died in the flames, either from smoke inhalation or refusing to flee. He was 61 years old. His body was found with a rifle nearby, suggesting he may have chosen to die fighting rather than escape. The house burned completely. Whether his death was murder, suicide, or a combination remained ambiguous, a fitting end for a man whose life had been defined by violence. Kurt Knispel never faced these decisions. The highest-scoring tank ace of the war, credited with destroying more than 160 enemy tanks, Knispel died on April 28, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender. He was 23 years old. A shell fragment struck his head when his King Tiger was hit during fighting near Verbovec in Czechoslovakia. He died 2 hours later and was buried in a mass grave with 15 other German soldiers. Knispel had been a troublemaker by SS standards. He wore his hair long, had a tattoo, and once physically confronted an officer he witnessed abusing prisoners. His individualism and his relatively low rank meant he never received the propaganda treatment given to officers like Michael Wittmann. Wittmann himself, the celebrated Tiger ace, had died in combat on August 8, 1944, in Normandy, his Tiger destroyed by Allied forces near Caen. Both men were spared the post-war reckoning because they fell before the reckoning arrived. Hermann Balck survived and was treated more gently than most. A brilliant panzer general, Balck commanded divisions, corps, and armies with tactical skill that even his enemies respected. He surrendered to American forces on May 8, 1945. He was held as a prisoner until 1947, then briefly imprisoned by German authorities in 1948 for a limited connection to war crimes, but released after several months. Unlike the ideological Nazis, Balck had been a professional officer focused on military operations rather than politics. After release, he worked as a manual laborer in a supply depot to support his family. In later years, he contributed to U.S. Army historical projects, providing detailed accounts of German operations for American military education. Balck represented a third category of German tank commander, the professional soldier who, while serving a criminal regime, maintained enough personal distance from its worst atrocities to eventually be rehabilitated as a military historian rather than punished as a war criminal. The transformation of some German tank officers into Cold War assets began almost immediately. By 1947, as tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union hardened into the Cold War, American and British intelligence services began recruiting former Wehrmacht officers for their knowledge of Soviet tactics and terrain. The Gehlen Organization, a German intelligence network that had operated on the Eastern Front, was absorbed into American intelligence operations. Former Panzer officers who had fought in Russia were debriefed extensively. Their maps, their tactical assessments, their understanding of Soviet armored doctrine became valuable intelligence assets. The moral calculus shifted. Men who had invaded Poland and France, who had participated in wars of aggression, suddenly found themselves positioned as experts on the new enemy. Their military experience outweighed their political past in the eyes of intelligence agencies preparing for potential conflict with Stalin. West Germany's rearmament formalized this rehabilitation. In 1955, when West Germany joined NATO and established the Bundeswehr, The new German armed forces required experienced officers. The Cold War demanded trained personnel who understood modern, mechanized warfare. Former Wehrmacht generals Adolf Heusinger and Hans Speidel were sworn into the Bundeswehr in November 1955. Speidel became the first general officer of the new army and played a key role in integrating West Germany into NATO structures. Other panzer officers followed. They brought their institutional knowledge, their training systems, their tactical doctrines into the Bundeswehr. The requirement was simple. They had to pass denazification proceedings, proving they had not been committed Nazis or war criminals. For many Wehrmacht officers, this standard was achievable. The Waffen-SS officers were excluded. Their organization's designation as criminal made them ineligible for military service. But regular Army tank commanders, if their records were clean enough or their connections strong enough, could rebuild military careers defending Western Europe against Soviet armor. The denazification process itself was uneven and often perfunctory. In the immediate post-war years, Allied authorities processed millions of Germans through tribunals designed to categorize their involvement with the Nazi regime. But the system was overwhelmed. By 1948, with the Berlin blockade underway and Cold War priorities dominant, denazification enforcement weakened. Many Germans who might have faced serious consequences in 1945 or 1946 received minimal sanctions by 1949. Tank commanders who could document they had not personally ordered atrocities, who had not been in the SS, who could find witnesses to testify to their non-political military service, often passed through denazification as followers rather than offenders. The burden of proof shifted. The need for reconstruction and defense took precedence over thorough accounting of wartime actions. Some tank commanders simply disappeared, not into graves or prisons, but into the vast anonymity of post-war Europe's displaced populations and rebuilding societies. Men who feared prosecution changed their names, moved to other countries, took up different professions. South America became a destination for some fleeing justice. Others remained in Germany under new identities. The chaos of the immediate post-war period, with millions of refugees, destroyed records, and overwhelmed bureaucracies, created opportunities for reinvention that would become impossible in later decades when documentation and cross-referencing improved. The divide between Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS remained the crucial distinction determining post-war fates. Wehrmacht tank commanders, unless directly implicated in specific war crimes, generally faced detention, interrogation, and eventual release. Many returned to civilian professions, engineering, business, farming. Some wrote memoirs that contributed to the growing literature on armored warfare, becoming unofficial historians of the campaigns they had fought. Their books sold well in West Germany, where populations were eager to separate military professionalism from Nazi criminality, to honor soldiers while condemning the regime. Waffen-SS tank officers faced harsher judgment. Even those not convicted of war crimes found employment difficult. The SS tattoo under the left arm, marking blood type, became a permanent identifier. Many had it surgically removed. But employers, neighbors, local authorities, everyone knew the SS veterans. They formed tight-knit social networks, supporting each other economically and psychologically. HIAG provided this function, offering legal assistance, job referrals, and social solidarity to men society had designated as outcasts. The generational shift mattered too. Tank commanders who had been in their 20s and 30s during the war were in their 50s and 60s by the 1970s. They retired from whatever second careers they had built. Their wartime service became increasingly distant history. Younger Germans born during or after the war related to them not as warriors of a defeated regime, but as elderly relatives with complicated pasts. The aggressive public debates about Wehrmacht criminality and SS atrocities that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s forced re-examination of the clean Wehrmacht myth. Historical scholarship demonstrated that regular army units, including panzer divisions, had participated in war crimes, had cooperated with SS killing squads, had implemented criminal orders. But by then, many of the men in question were elderly or dead. Legal prosecution became practically difficult and politically complicated. The irony was profound and multi-layered. Men who had commanded some of history's most destructive military machines, who had participated in invasions that killed tens of millions, faced consequences that ranged from execution to comfortable retirement, depending on factors often unrelated to their actual moral culpability. Membership in the SS versus Wehrmacht, the specific units they commanded, whether their crimes were documented by witnesses or buried in the chaos of battle, whether they were captured by Soviets or Americans. These circumstances determined outcomes more than the abstract question of responsibility for aggressive war. Piper, who ordered villages burned, faced trial. Guderian, whose troops executed commissars, wrote best-selling memoirs. Carius, who killed hundreds in battle, sold aspirin and cough syrup for 5 decades. The post-war accounting was never systematic, never complete, never entirely just. What happened to German tank commanders after World War II was not one story, but dozens, each shaped by the specific intersection of personal actions, organizational affiliations, documentary evidence, capturing power, and historical timing. The grand strategic outcome was that Germany's expertise in armored warfare was not lost. It was transferred, adapted, and integrated into NATO's Cold War military structures through the men who survived, rehabilitated, and resumed military or civilian roles. The Allied powers faced a pragmatic choice: prosecute all complicit officers and lose institutional military knowledge, or selectively punish the most culpable while co-opting the rest into new defense structures. They chose pragmatism. The moral cost of that choice remains debated. The tactical benefit was that Western armies absorbed German armored doctrine, training methods, and combat experience, strengthening NATO's conventional capabilities against Soviet armor. The men who had perfected blitzkrieg against Poland and France now advised on defensive strategies against Warsaw Pact tanks. Yesterday's enemies became today's instructors. By the 1980s, most of the tank commanders who had fought in World War II were dead or very old. Guderian had died in 1954, Dietrich in 1966, Piper in 1976, Balk in 1978. Carius survived until 2015, an anachronism, a living link to battles that had shaped the century. Their legacy was complex and contradictory. They had demonstrated that tactical brilliance could serve monstrous ends. They had shown that professional military skill and personal moral responsibility were separate questions. They had proven that in the calculus of geopolitics, past crimes could be outweighed by present utility. The tank commanders of the Third Reich disappeared into 3 destinations: graves, prisons, and second chances. Which destination they reached depended less on justice than on the chaotic intersection of law, politics, evidence, and luck that characterized Europe's attempt to reckon with a war that had exceeded all previous human capacity for organized violence. The post-war fate of these men reflected the broader paradox of dealing with a defeated Germany. Total punishment was impractical. Total forgiveness was unconscionable. The compromise was selective justice, pragmatic rehabilitation, and historical amnesia where convenient. German tank commanders experienced all 3. Some hanged, some thrived. Most simply faded into the rebuilding European landscape, carrying their memories, their skills, and their secrets into futures their younger selves could never have imagined when they rolled across borders in 1939, believing they were invincible. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.